Hello, folks. First, let me apologize to those of you who are wondering where the John Wood Jr. show went. While I'm still fairly active with the Braver Angels podcast and now also writing a regular column for USA Today, the John Wood Jr. show has been mothballed, relaunched, and then mothballed again, simply because of bandwidth issues, really. But I do plan on reinventing it and regularizing it for good as we move towards the end of September here, so stay tuned. But before I do that, I did want to release this short conversation I had with the highly esteemed Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ayaan and I spoke briefly all the way back in May of this year. We had met briefly before that at a conference. I've long been an admirer of hers, not just on account of her intelligence, but on account of her courage. For those who do not know, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, her life is quite really the stuff of novels. Born in Somalia, subjected to the horrors of female genital mutilation in an extreme Islamic culture, Ayaan is a celebrated scholar who served in the Dutch parliament, speaks multiple languages, and has been honored around the world. She has also been sharply criticized for her strong opposition to religious fundamentalism in general, but to Islamic fundamentalism in particular. Ayaan has suffered the sting of political polarization in various ways, but I make special mention of her courage in this introduction because while there are many brave activists in the world, Ayaan's stands have meant that her physical safety is something that can never be taken for granted. She has lived under the constant shadow of death threats for years owing to her critiques of Islam. Very few public intellectuals know what it's like to live day to day with truly credible threats of violence hanging over them, but Ayaan certainly does. The world was reminded of this when Ali's friend Salman Rushdie, author of the book The Satanic Verses, was stabbed live on stage during an event only days ago. The Satanic Verses was a book that's criticisms of Islam and the Prophet Muhammad earned Rushdie the declaration of a fatwa by the Ayatollah Khomeini all the way back in 1989, ordering Rushdie's death at the hands of any Muslim who could accomplish it. This many years later, someone has very nearly succeeded. To be clear, I am not someone given to wanton criticisms of Islam. That subject is a complicated one, and it is not really what Ayaan and I discussed in our very brief audio-only conversation here. We only were scheduled for 30 minutes. I wasn't feeling well and had technical issues, and she was running behind, so we agreed to make this merely the start of our correspondence. But it was nice to chat with her for a few minutes anyway on race, polarization, nonviolence, and virtue, and what I hope to be just the first of however many meaningful conversations to come. So without further ado, here is Ayaan Hirsi Ali on the John Wood Jr. Show. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, welcome to the John Wood Jr. Show.
John, it's wonderful to see you again. We just met a few weeks ago in Dallas, and it's lovely to talk to you again.
Yeah, we did, and it was a real honor being able to be in a space with you. Without, as I said to you, I'll record a separate introduction, but I think that one thing worth saying about you, Ayaan, is that you are a person, in the estimation of many, who is possessed of many virtues. But I think that even your strongest critics would have to acknowledge, perhaps one above all, which is your undeniable courage. Anybody who knows anything about your life, whether they agree with the stands you've taken or not, I think have to be compelled to recognize the fact that you are a person who's been singularly brave in the life that you've lived. And I think that is an inspiration for many of us.
Thank you. I thank you. Those are very kind words from you, and I'm humbled. And I didn't set out to be brave or courageous.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of us, when we reach our limit for pain and fear, what happens, I guess, is you either fight or you flee.
Right.
Very often we also freeze. But in my case, I think there have been a few times when it was just healthier and better to fight back instead of succumbing to what I was asked to do.
Indeed. I do suppose that there are times when perhaps courage is the only viable option that life leads you. But in any event, we are grateful for the courage that you show. I want to ask you a question that I sort of got around to asking something like this in the panel conversation that you had at the old Parkland conference where you and I met, and you were on a panel with Camille Foster and Delano. Oh goodness, I'm blanking on Delano's last name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also call him Delano. Like, I see him as Delano.
He's a great commentator, personality, really colorful, smart guy. He has a show on the Blaze, and folks should check him out. He's worth listening to. But there is, among sort of, conservative African American circles, well, not just African American circles, but on sort of center left to conservative right circles in American society in general, this larger sort of quest to combat the excesses of what people call the woke left. And I think that in our politics generally, there's sort of this reflexive embrace of debate and polemic as a way of sort of fighting and winning culture wars and political battles. But at that conference, you may recall that I tried to advocate for something of an empathetic approach to relating to some of the experiences that drive some of the emotions of folks on the social justice left. And I, in part, sort of relate that to what I take from the philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr., the philosophy of nonviolence, which is sort of this active application of the idea of loving your enemies, right? As the means of being able to speak to their conscience. You're a person who's lived a life that has been, as I alluded to, sort of called upon to face the very present reality of physical threat and physical harm. Your political stance have gone beyond just rhetorical backlash, right? And so, for a person like yourself, I don't put forward the notion that maybe there's a way to use empathy in reaching our opponents lightly, because I don't want to make it sound like a trivial sort of question. Nevertheless, though, I do want to ask if in your travels and experiences and studies, when you look at the examples of Martin Luther King Jr., when you look at the example of perhaps Mahatma Gandhi, and others who have used means of love and peace to affect social change in ways that have impacted culture, do you in politics, do you think that there are moral or strategic lessons to be learned from these examples, or are they limited in their relevance to the cultural fights that you and others are undertaking today?
I think in terms of limitations, every human being is flawed. Every idea and the human beings that advance those ideas is constrained in some way. So we all have our constraints, we have our limitations, we have our flaws. But what I find appealing from Martin Luther King's approach to race relations in the US at a time when it was part of the law to segregate and subjugate and oppress human beings only because of the skin of their color. That he had this powerful approach, which I think is it's going to last, and it has lasted well beyond Martin Luther's time. He says, I have a dream that one day we will be judged according to our character, not the color of our skin. And that's extremely powerful. I mean, that right there is empathy and human compassion. And he expressed, as he should have, as we all do, anger about the injustice itself and the pain as a Black person living in the United States in Martin Luther King's time, Martin Luther King Jr.'s time. And to translate that anger into something so constructive and that transcends, I mean, you'd almost call it like a human, it's almost superhuman to then say to your enemy, I'm willing to forgive you. I'm willing to forget. I'm willing to be your brother.
Right.
Let's judge one another, not based on the basis of superficial identity, things like skin color, but on our common humanity. For him to do that is extremely powerful. extremely powerful. And I've learned a lot from it, and I still learn a lot from it. And I think when we talk about empathy, even today, when those laws are no longer in place, but there's still a lot of injustice in our society. And it's injustice against Black people, it's injustice against women, but it's also injustice against some white people. And we see that. So I think we've moved on from the historic times when one set of people were exclusively committing crimes against another set of human beings. It's no longer like that. It's a mixed bag today. And so I applaud the people who want to keep reminding us of these injustices, these disparities that we discussed at Old Parkland between the races and between fellow human beings, but that we have to express the anger, the dissatisfaction, the frustration at these injustices with a great deal of empathy. Let's love our enemy. Let's love our fellow human beings. Let's go back to that message of Martin Luther King Jr. of character, character, character. And these superficialities on skin color, gender, identity traits that as a human being are a given. I can't do anything about my skin color. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to.
Right.
If you want to judge me by who I am, judge me by what I do and what I say and the consistency there. And there lies the character building. But also, I think there lies the pathway to appeal to the empathy of the other and the compassion of the other. So we can strongly disagree. And I think disagreement is human. It's universal, it's human, it's going to be with us for all time. But it is, as you say many times, how do we resolve these disagreements in a non-violent way?
Indeed. Part of the reason why I wanted to begin the conversation by saying a few words about virtue is because I believe that virtue is something that does transcend ideology ultimately. I mean, I would like to believe that you could have a person who is, a strongly left-leaning progressive or strongly right-leaning conservative, and yet if they're both honest, if they're both compassionate, if they're both courageous, if they are both humble, then these are two individuals both worthy of respect, even if perhaps, I might feel that one is more right or more wrong on given issues. And so I suspect that you might sympathize with the idea that we need to have a fuller conversation, perhaps a fuller cultural exploration of virtue, of character, in a way that allows it not to be replaced by ideology as a stand-in for your worth as a human being, right? Yeah. Yeah. And so I think whereas, the color of one's skin was perhaps a stand-in in previous eras, and, racial matters are complex and we could say more about that, but I think that political ideology and affiliation sort of occupies sort of that perverse shorthand in our current conversational landscape in many ways.
Right. I think so. My background, I didn't grow up in the United States of America. So sometimes, I think I'm deaf and blind to some of the baggage American history has with it based on skin color and that kind of thing. But I do come from a society where women were treated and still are treated in some ways worse than African Americans were treated back during the days of segregation and even slavery. And that kind of subjection, where you're not really fighting against a group that have a different skin color, or you're fighting against a government that imposes this, we did all of that. Mm-hmm. But we are usually fighting against our own family members. It's, for instance, in my case, it's my mother who had the fanatical belief that women are less than men. Mm. Right. And it's my father who had the fanatical belief that it was his responsibility to force me into marriage. And so how can you love these people at the same time? They're my parents. Mm. I wouldn't be alive without them. Right. And they're operating from a culture and a religion that dictates these different and unequal and unjust treatment for boys and girls, men and women. So how can I be their daughter and love them? And yet make them stop the subjection? make them stop the oppression, make them stop the pain. And I don't want to say I succeeded in doing that. I succeeded in getting away from it. But the harm continues and the pain continues. And I think what I've learned from my past is that the fanaticism, this, you talked about ideology. In my case, it was religion, which I think is a form of ideology anyway. But the fanaticism with which people adhere to these things, that they forget that you are actually engaging with another human being. I like to believe that all human beings are bipartisan. I like to be, we have that, I'm not always consistently conservative on all issues.
Right.
I'm not always consistently liberal on all issues. And in fact, with some issues, I have no clue. I may spew my opinion, but I have no clue what I'm talking about, which is, again, another universal human trait. We try to minimize that. The older and wiser we get and the more knowledge we take in. But in general, I think it is fanaticism. And I'm seeing in the landscape of America now, if you turn on the news now, you're going to hear about the school shooting in Texas. Mm-hmm. And when something as horrific as that happens, instead of us coming together, we start to do our party lines and talking points and gun control this and immigration that. And it's just something terrible has just happened. Mm. And it's so awful. Can we please just sit down together and see how can we make sure that that doesn't happen again?
Right.
Yeah. And that's empathy, I think, that is, ironically, it's bipartisan. I think both parties in America want to stop the mass shootings.
I think so. And yet all of these other things that, we're naming, and many things we don't have time to name, stand in the way of that. But I do suspect that with ideology and fanaticism and fanatical approaches to religion, these are all systems that allow us to dehumanize each other in a way that causes us to forget our capacity for intergroup and interpersonal connection. And if we can establish that, maybe we can reason together again, right?
Yeah, because that what you just said now calls for humility.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I think the most arrogant expression of human behavior it's the fanaticism. It is that I am right and you are wrong, come what may.
Right.
And that you don't exercise that humility of just taking one step back and just listening. What is he saying? What's she saying? Let me take that in first. Where is she coming from? What's her interest, his interest? And then maybe plead and appeal to the other person to say, and listen to me. And with that humility in place, I think you could work something out. And I think most Americans, honestly, are humble and really engaged in problem solving. I'm frustrated with our leaders, the people we elected, the people, for whatever reason, who are our elite. I'm really frustrated with how they handle some of these basic issues where I think most Americans actually agree on.
Right, indeed. Well, I share that frustration. It's unfair of me to spring this on you as a last question, and I'm hoping that it can be a lead-in to a continuation of our conversation sometime. But you're a person who, of course, has taken a very strong stand against the teachings of Islam, but also I think religion, broadly speaking, insofar as I think that you identify very much as a non-believer. But I would be curious to ask you, I mentioned Dr. King and Gandhi, and, the philosophy of nonviolence was, King thought of it as a spiritual philosophy of social change, right? And, informed not just by Christianity, but through Gandhi, by Hinduism and other spiritual traditions. Does religion it not have positive resources, in your view, to contribute to this larger project of humanizing one another? Is that not itself part of the legacy of religion here that we should pull upon, or do you look at it as sort of a zero-sum negative?
No, it's not zero-sum. I see religion used as a tool for doing good things, very, very powerful, and it happens all the time. Yeah. And when I review these religions, these different religions, the one I grew up in, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, I even see a hierarchy there that some religions are better than others. I think Christianity, in many ways, has been, because of the figure, Jesus Christ, who established the Christian religion, some of his examples and sayings can be used universally and to the end of days to be a tool for good, for compassion, for kindness, for charity, for service. Islam has some of those qualities, and so do the other religions. In some religions, they emphasize those qualities more than they emphasize the qualities of, when I spoke up against the oppression coming again from my own parents. They would say, sorry, I can't help it. God said so. So you could say, you could use God as a tool to dehumanize others. And you could also, as a human being, in your religious way, be extremely fanatical and unreasonable. But I've also spent now enough years with fellow atheists, and they can be just as fanatical. They don't need religion for that.
Well.
And so, exactly. So fanaticism is not a quality of religion. Fanaticism is a quality of the human being. And we as human beings, we have to realize, I have to take the responsibility to say, okay, I wasn't nuanced in the past. I did at times create the impression that I was saying all Muslims are fanatics, that all Muslims are violent, or that all Muslims oppress their women. That's wrong, but it's my responsibility. It's me to take the knowledge and the wisdom and all the good stuff that I've really had to back away from that position. It was up to me. It's up to me to back away from the position that religion is only a tool for evil. Because if I maintain that, and it's contrary to fact, if I maintain that religion is only a tool for oppression, then I'm just as fanatical as the fanatics that I am criticizing. What makes me then different from the people who are using religion to say, come what may, you've left our religion, therefore your head needs to be cut off? What makes me different if I'm just as fanatical in my position? So I think it is not, I get this question a lot. Religion can be a tool for good and it can be a tool for harm. Some religions are better than others. And fanaticism and evil is in the human being, and it is in every human being. It's just, as a society, as a civilization, we need to recognize that and come up with ways of transcending our evil side and quietening it down.
Indeed. Ayaan, it's a pleasure and an honor to speak to you, and I do look forward to continuing the conversation when we can. Thank you so very much.
John, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for letting me end perfectly on time, and guaranteed, I promise you a continuation of this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So, okay.
Bye-bye.